The American colonists really did have quite a lot of stake. Now, they didn't necessarily have the connection to the battle for the European thrones. That was sort of loose, although they were definitely patriotically British and they supported British interests. But for them, the war was definitely more about how it affected them personally. Trade might be curtailed. Again, those raids, the Indian allies are most definitely going to be known for raiding the western frontier, a great deal of terrorizing of individual settlers. Um, and so that's why there was such a strong relationship with the British regulars. They might be looked down on, or they might be looking down on the British colonists, but they were definitely a key part of their security. And then, of course, you also have this growing, what's going to eventually become Manifest Destiny, this growing idea of expansion. There are definitely colonists who have already gone beyond British boundaries and settled into regions that were technically claimed by France. So some individuals are going to want to get back to their homesteads where they fled during the war. Other individuals are definitely going to want to go ahead and start moving west because of the opportunity for presumably cheap land. Remember, we're not considering the Indians themselves in this. So as we're coming up to the revolution, prior to this time, there is no indication of discontent prior to the 1770s. What we're getting into that's really beginning the idea of independence partially is coming from that idea of taxation without representation, and also what's coming to be more direct interference or more direct rule in the British colonies. Because Great Britain itself has been so much distracted by internal European affairs, by trying to keep control of Ireland, by expanding their Asian trade routes, quite often the American colonies are left in a period of what's called benign neglect. They're not intentionally ignoring them, but there are other priorities. And so the colonists are very much used to basically fending for themselves. They definitely, of course, still have the influence of royal treasurers, royal governors, and yet for their day to day life, they've incorporated so many of their English customs, created some new American customs to deal with specific circumstances, and so they're sort of used to being on their own and used to controlling their own affairs. So they're not really used to this idea that Great Britain is now going to have a much stronger personal interest into what's going on in the colonies. And the colonists tend to see this as a little intrusive. Um, the idea of taxation without representation. Now, the British coffers are getting kind of thin from these numbers of wars. And also, this new territory that has been gained by the French, it's going to be very expensive to uphold. Not just because of trying to pay indemnities to France, not just because of trying to take control of the area, but they're also trying to deal with the Indian allies, trying to cultivate relationships with the French Indians so they're not going to have too much trouble in this area. Really, the only way to do that is to say that their own subjects are not going to penetrate much further. Of course, the American colonists do want to penetrate further. They're also going to have to look at other ways of taxation. It's very convenient for the British government to leave a portion of the British Army there. Because they're no longer at war, they don't really want a lot of ex soldiers coming back to Britain and having nothing to do. So if they stay in the Americas and stay there to keep order, that's really a load off Parliament's mind. Although, again, not something the American colonists are really happy about. So these taxes are passed to try and gain revenue to pay for the war and also for this continued upkeep of military protection in the Americas. Now, there is no income tax in Great Britain or in the Americas, so it's none of so this is really all about taxing specific goods. The idea of taxing specific goods are then going to be sort of like sales tax in a way, but only for certain goods. For example, tea is going to be one of the items taxed. Sugar, flour, Window taxes are very, very common. So common to the extent that if a window tax is introduced, so therefore the more windows you have, the wealthier you're considered to be. Individuals will start boarding up windows in their home so they don't have to pay the tax. The other thing that's referred to is a stamp tax, and we don't necessarily mean just stamps for letters, but any good moving between colonies or going across the Atlantic has to have a stamp of recognition. So anything like that, and then of course any legal documents, they would also have a fee. So really, the colonists feel like they're being nickel and dimed whatever they do. Now, their main argument is of course the fact that they have no direct representation. Now, Britain thought this was actually very odd when the colonists began using this argument because no one in Great Britain has direct representation inside the government. If you are running for a member of parliament, as opposed to in the United States where members of Congress actually have to reside in their district, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to reside in your district. If you live in Surrey, which is near London, you can run for a district in the Upper Midlands. If you live in Cornwall, you can run for a district in Southampton. So no one's really directly represented. Of course, they're going to try and cater to your interest in order to get your vote, but it's very different from what the colonists are used to. They have their own individual governing bodies in which they get together and try to reconcile laws and how they're going to live. And because everyone is so locally involved, they're able to have direct representatives. So this was something that the colonists needed to get through everyday life, and the British really just don't understand. The British say, look, you're not directly represented, but we do think of your interest overall when we are debating these measures. Now, the taxes compared to taxes that British individuals in Great Britain and England would actually have to pay are relatively small. But this doesn't necessarily mean fairness for the colonists as they see it. So there's going to become increasing tension between the colonies and Great Britain, particularly in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the major commercial centers in America. Now, the British Army there is going to attempt to cut down on colonial resistance to obeying the laws, but this clamping down is going to turn increasingly violent in the summer of 1775. Now, the colonists have had one Congress, the First Continental Congress, when these tax laws were being introduced to decide what are we going to do about this. Are we going to obey these laws? Is there a way we can get around it? And can we try to make sure we have consensus between all 13 colonies? Now, when it becomes apparent that the British Army is going to use force, and deadly force, in the resulting of the Boston Massacre, the colonies then decide, okay, we are going to convene a Second Continental Congress. This convention of delegates from the colonies is again to discuss the response to British action, this increased military use. Now, 1775, we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There are rumors spreading in Massachusetts that the British regulars are going to a small town where there is an armament, where there's supplies of guns and gunpowder. The American militia is basically camped out on the road, and they're prepared to stop the British Army. It's a very, very small skirmish, basically some shooting back and forth. But when this occurs, it's a signal to the convention that, okay, we're now no longer dealing with specifically a way of negotiating with Congress or with Parliament. We're probably now definitely at war.